What would you do if you walked into a room full of men who had never once contradicted the most dangerous person on the coast, opened your mouth on your very first day, told him flatly that he was wrong, and watched every single person at that table stop breathing while he turned his terrible attention on you? Nobody argued with Emiliano Vasari, not his capos, not his rivals, not the men who had known him 30 years. He had not lost an argument since he was 19 years old, and the reason was simple. Nobody had ever been willing to try. And then a soft, quiet, generously curved forensic accountant, nobody had bothered to learn the name of, set down a folder, said the word no, and proceeded, in under 4 minutes, to take him apart with nothing but arithmetic. This is a story of hidden worth, of a woman taught her whole life to swallow what she knew, and of the ruthless man who discovered that being beaten was the most intoxicating thing that had ever happened to him. Odette Reyes had spent 32 years being right and saying nothing. She was soft and generously curved, with a round, serious face and a low voice. She had trained to stay level, and she had learned before she was 20 that a woman shaped like her, who also happened to be the smartest person in the room, made everybody uncomfortable, and that discomfort had a price she could not afford to pay. So she had made herself small. She wrote memos nobody read. She flagged problems in the margins, and watched men with better suits present her findings as their own 6 weeks later. She had been passed over 4 times at a firm where she carried half the department, and when she asked why, a partner told her, kindly, that she was tremendously capable, but that clients respond to a certain kind of presence, and Odette had gone home and understood exactly what he meant. What none of them ever discovered was what she was actually built for, because Odette Reyes could argue, not loudly. She had never raised her voice in her life. But her mind assembled the case the way a stonemason builds a wall, one weight-bearing fact at a time. And when she was finished, there was simply nowhere left for the other person to stand. Twice in her career, she had let herself do it, fully, without hedging. Both times she had been right, and both times the room went silent and cold, and both times she learned the same lesson. People would rather be wrong than be corrected by her. So she folded it away and got very good at being useful and invisible. And then a contract came through her firm that nobody else wanted, an audit of a shipping conglomerate that everyone in the building knew was something else entirely, and Odette Reyes, who had nothing left to lose, and a mother's care facility to pay for, took it. She had no idea she was about to walk into the one room on earth where being right out loud would change everything. Emiliano Vasari was the reason rooms had temperatures. He was tall and broad and dressed in a charcoal suit, cut with lethal precision. The head of a syndicate that owned the ports and the freight lines, and the fear of every powerful family for 100 miles, and he was rumored to end a life with a single unhurried nod. He rarely raised his voice. He never needed to. And the thing that everybody in his world understood, the thing that had become almost a joke among men who did not make jokes, was that Emiliano Vasari did not lose arguments. It was not that he shouted anyone down. It was that he was genuinely, exhaustingly right, and that on the rare occasions he was not. The person across from him weighed the value of being correct against the value of continuing to exist, and made the sensible choice. He had been surrounded for 15 years by agreement, and had grown so tired of it he had stopped noticing. On the morning Odette Reyes came into his boardroom, He was in the middle of restructuring a freight route, and the 11 men at that table were nodding along the way. They always did. She had been seated at the far end, a soft woman in a plain gray suit with a folder in front of her, and nobody had introduced her, and Emiliano had registered her presence the way you register a chair. Then he laid out the route, and she said quietly, "No." The room stopped. Every head turned. One of the capos actually put a hand out as though to physically stop her from continuing. Emiliano lifted his eyes to the end of the table and looked at her for the first time. "I beg your pardon," he said. And Odette Reyes, who had spent 32 years swallowing what she knew, felt the old fear rise in her throat, and then thought about 4 passed-over promotions, and a lifetime of watching men repeat her sentences badly, and did something she had not done in 9 years. She opened the folder. "Your route is wrong," she said. "Not risky. Wrong. You are moving inbound freight through the southern terminal on a Thursday, and the southern terminal changed its customs rotation in March." She turned a page without hurrying. "Your own paperwork shows you paying overtime to a night crew that no longer exists on that shift, which means somebody is signing off on hours nobody worked, which means either you are being robbed or you are creating a paper trail that any auditor could follow straight to your door." Silence. She turned another page. "And the reason nobody at this table has told you is that your last 3 quarterly summaries were prepared by the same office, and every one of them rounded the same discrepancy into the same column. It took me an hour and 40 minutes to find, Mr. Vasari. I would very much like to know why it has taken everyone else 8 months." Nobody at that table breathed. Emiliano Vasari sat perfectly still for a long moment, and then, to the absolute horror of every man present, the most dangerous person on the coast leaned back in his chair and laughed. It was not a pleasant sound because he was out of practice, but it was real. "Everybody out," he said. And when the room had emptied, he turned to the soft, quiet, terrified woman at the end of his table and said, "What is your name?" It began that day, and it did not stop. Emiliano Vasari discovered, at the age of 41, that he had been starving for something he could not have named, and that the something was a person who would tell him no. He did not put Odette back in a windowless office. He put her at the table, and then he began, deliberately, to argue with her. He would come to her with a decision already made, and lay it out and wait. And Odette, who spent 2 weeks apologizing before every disagreement, slowly stopped apologizing. He shot down her recommendation on the Eastern warehouses. She came back with 3 years of comparative freight data and shot down his counter, and he read it and said quietly, "You are right." And then, when she looked up in shock, "Do not look so surprised, Tostarda. It happens to me now, roughly twice a week." And Odette Reyes, who had been taught her whole life that being right out loud was a thing that cost her, found herself in a house where being right out loud was the entire reason she was wanted. She began to unfold. It happened in her posture first, then her voice, then her clothes, because Emiliano simply arranged for a tailor to appear, and told the woman to build a wardrobe for someone who intended to be listened to. Odette stood before a mirror in deep emerald and apologized reflexively for how much of her there was. And Emiliano said from the doorway that she should stop that immediately, that she was the only person in his organization who had never wasted his time, and that she would take up exactly as much room as she pleased in his house. She stopped apologizing, and the arguments became something else, though neither of them said so. They happened at night now over a decanter of amber whiskey he poured for himself and a glass of red he poured for her, in a study with the tall windows open to the water. He learned she hummed when she was thinking. He learned she flinched at raised voices and softened at kindness, and it made him want to burn down every person who had taught her to fold herself away. He told her about the father he had buried and the trust he had learned to bury with him, things he had never said to another living soul. And one night at her door his hand rose to cradle her jaw, his thumb brushing her cheek, and Odette thought he might finally cross the distance, and instead he only looked at her, memorizing her, and murmured good night, and left her standing there with her heart going like a bird. But Odette, being Odette, had never stopped pulling the thread she had found on her very first morning. Because the discrepancy in that southern terminal had bothered her, and when she went looking for its edges, it did not have any. It kept going. The cruelty came at a formal dinner, and it arrived wearing sapphires. Emiliano had seated Odette at his right hand in a gown of deep emerald that celebrated every curve she had spent 32 years apologizing for, and midway through the evening, a sleek, beautiful woman named Sabine Aldrich, who had spent 2 years positioning herself to be the next Mrs. Appersh. Vasari cornered her by the sideboard with an audience in tow. "Oh, the accountant," Sabine said brightly, loud enough for the room, letting her eyes travel over Odette's body with theatrical sympathy. "How novel!" She smiled like a blade. "Sweetheart, I do hope somebody has explained the arrangement to you. Emiliano collects clever things," briefly. "But nobody looks at a girl who does sums in a back office and sees a queen. And when he tires of being contradicted, and he will, you will discover you were never actually at this table. You were just the evening's entertainment." The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees, and the old Odette would have folded, apologized, and slipped out to compose herself in a bathroom. But something had been rebuilt in her over those weeks, and she did not shrink. "You may be right," she said, her low voice carrying with perfect calm. "So let us test it." She turned slightly to include the table. "Your family's foundation filed its charitable disclosure 11 days late this year, as it did last year, and both filings show a transfer out to a consultancy that shares a registered address with your brother's holding company." She tilted her head. "I do sums in a back office, Miss Aldrich. It is a marvelous vantage point. From back there you can see absolutely everyone." The silence had teeth. Sabine went the color of ash and left the room. And Emiliano, who had crossed the floor in silence, took Odette's hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles in front of the entire table. "You never make yourself small in this house again, Testarda," he murmured. "Not in my world, and never in front of me." But across that room a man who had smiled at Emiliano Vasari for 19 years had gone very still because he had just watched the accountant dismantle a woman from memory in 11 seconds, and he understood exactly what she would do to him if she ever turned that attention his way. The man was Teodoro Bracchi, Emiliano's consigliere, and he had been stealing for 6 years. It had been elegant work. He had not touched the money directly. He had built a ghost, a night crew at the southern terminal that existed only on paper, 60 men clocking hours. Nobody worked, and every fortnight that payroll went out into an account he controlled. 6 years of it. Invisible, because the only person who ever looked at payroll was Teodoro himself, and because Emiliano Vasari had a great many enemies and had never thought to look for one holding his own pen. Then, a woman had walked into a boardroom, spent 1 hour and 40 minutes with a folder and found the loose corner of it before she had learned anybody's name. Teodoro had spent every day since watching her pull. He smiled, thin and cold, and began, very quietly, to plan. And what he planned was clever, because Teodoro Bracchi had spent 19 years learning exactly how his boss's mind worked. He would not simply kill her. He would first make her the thief. Odette found it in the middle of a Tuesday night, and she found it the way she found everything, which was by refusing to leave a loose corner alone. The ghost crew resolved into an account, and the account resolved into a chain of 3 shell consultancies, and the chain terminated after 4 nights of work in a signature authorization that could only have been generated by one of 2 people in the entire organization. One of them was Emiliano. The other was the man who had stood at his shoulder for 19 years. And then Odette did the thing that made her dangerous, which was that she did not stop there. Because her good case is not a fact, it is a wall, and she built it. The payroll, the shells, the signature, the dates, the 3 occasions Teodoro Bracchi had personally approved a change to the audit schedule within a week of an inspection. She had it all by Friday. She brought it to Emiliano in the study and laid it out without drama, in order. And Emiliano Vasari went very still, and then he did the thing that undid her completely. He believed her instantly. He did not ask her twice. He did not send for a man with a title to confirm what an accountant had said. He read her wall, top to bottom, and then he set it down and said quietly, 19 years. Then he took her face in his hands and said, the thing that would matter more than either of them realized. If I move on him now, he will not come at me. He said, he will come at you, and he will not come with a gun first. He is cleverer than that. He will come with a story. And 2 days later, Teodoro Bracchi went to the commission and told them that Emiliano Vasari's new accountant had been robbing him for 6 years. It was, Odette admitted later, beautifully done. Teodoro had spent 6 years signing things in a way that looked, to an outside eye, like oversight rather than authorship, and had spent 2 weeks creating a paper trail with her name on it, access logs, an account opened in a name close enough to hers to sting. And the story he told the 5 families was the most persuasive story in that world, that a boss had gone soft, that a clever woman had turned his head, and that while everyone watched him fall in love, she had been draining him. The commission called a hearing, and the night before it, they came for her anyway, because Teodoro Bracchi did not believe in leaving arguments to chance. The fortress went dark at 2:30. Odette woke to a silence, so complete it pressed against her skin, and every instinct 32 years of paying attention had honed screamed that something was catastrophically wrong. The power was out. The generators stayed dead. Emiliano had been drawn out at midnight to a meeting she now understood was a fabrication. And Odette, sitting up in the dark, knew with terrible certainty that they had come while he was away, and that they had come for her, and that a woman found dead the night before a hearing would be a confession nobody would ever question. She did not scream. She did not faint. She did not run blindly. She thought cold and clear, the way she always had. 2 floors below, a silenced weapon coughed, and a body met the marble. And Odette Reyes did the only thing she had ever been good at, which was to work the problem. She did not go for a door, because they would be watching doors. She went for the study, because it held two things that mattered more than any exit: a hardwired line on its own circuit, and the wall of evidence she had spent 4 nights building, the only thing standing between Emiliano and a commission that had half decided he was finished. She got one message out, then she put every page into the floor safe behind the shelving that only 3 people knew existed and spun the dial, because if she did not survive the next 10 minutes, the case still had to. Only then did she think about herself. And here was what none of them had accounted for. Odette had audited that house the way she audited everything, which meant she had read its own service records out of sheer habit. And she knew a thing. The intruder's stolen floor plan did not show. The East Wing had a fire suppression system installed before the renovation and never removed, and its manual release was in the corridor she was standing in. She pulled it. System dumped, and the corridor filled instantly with a dense, roaring fog of suppressant, and 4 men in night goggles were abruptly completely blind, their optics washed to a white blaze, choking and shouting and stumbling into one another in a 50-foot hallway they did not know. Odette, who had counted every step of that corridor 100 times, walked out through the middle of them and into the linen room and locked the door. And she heard Teodoro Bracchi's voice, ruined dark, unhurried, still perfectly calm. "Odette," he called. "That was genuinely impressive." He was moving closer. "Do you know the worst of it? You made him interesting again. 19 years I managed. That man, I anticipated him. I was necessary to him. And then a bookkeeper told him no in a boardroom. And by the end of the month he was checking her opinion before mine. He stopped outside the linen room door. Tomorrow they will find you dead, and my case will be complete. It is not personal. You simply argued with the wrong man." And Odette Reyes, standing in the dark with her back against the shelving and her heart slamming, did the one thing he never expected. She argued. "You have made an error, Teodoro," she said through the door, and her voice did not shake. Silence. "If I die tonight," said, "you do not win your hearing. You lose it. Because the commission has been told I am a thief of 6 years, and thieves about to be exposed do one thing. They do not stay in the house of the man they robbed and wait politely to be murdered. A dead woman here the night before a hearing is not a confession. It is a loose end, and every one of the 5 families will spend a month asking who tidied it." She let that sit. "You need me alive and disgraced," she said. "You have needed that from the beginning. Which means the men out there are here to take me, not to kill me. And you have just told me the only thing I actually needed to know." Outside the door, Teodoro Bracchi said nothing at all, which was the closest thing to a concession she was ever going to get. And in that silence, the front gates below exploded inward with the tortured shriek of an engine pushed past its limits. Emiliano had come home. Time seemed to fracture. Gunfire erupted below, brief and brutal and absolute. Teodoro turned toward it, and in the blind, roaring fog of the corridor, he had no idea where the walls were. And Odette, who had counted every step of that hallway 100 times, came out of the linen room and put her shoulder into him at the exact place where the corridor narrowed. He went down hard against the wainscoting, his weapons skittering away into the white, and she kicked it into the dark and kept walking, because she knew precisely how many paces stood between her and the stairs. And then the fog thinned at the landing, and Emiliano filled the doorway soaked in rain, his eyes wild and searching. Carlo, his loyal lieutenant, poured in behind him with 4 armed men, and the trap Teodoro Bracchi had spent 6 years building snapped shut around him instead. Emiliano had him by the throat against the wall before he could speak. 19 years, he said. You stood at my shoulder for 19 years, and then you came into my house for her. Then he turned his head, and the murderous cold in his eyes dissolved into raw, naked fear. And he released Teodoro to Carlo's men and crossed to Odette in 2 strides. His hands moved frantically over her arms, her face, her shoulders, checking for blood, for wounds, for any harm to what was his. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Did he touch you? Look at me. Breathe. Tell me." "I'm all right," Odette wept, her fingers twisting in his soaked coat. "I set off the fire suppression on the whole east wing. You are going to receive an extremely upsetting invoice." Emiliano let out a broken, disbelieving laugh into her hair, and then he framed her tear-streaked face in his trembling hands and looked at her the way no one in her whole overlooked life had ever looked at her. "You are magnificent," he breathed. 19 years he stood beside me, and I never saw it, and you found him in 1 hour and 40 minutes with a folder." And then his voice cracked open entirely. "I have been arguing with you for 4 months because it was the only way I could think of to keep you talking to me," he said hoarsely. "I am done pretending. That is what it was." The hearing went ahead the following morning because Emiliano insisted on it, and because Odette insisted harder. The 5 families gathered in a long room with the shutters closed, and Teodoro Bracchi was brought in under guard and permitted to speak because that was the old way, and because Odette had specifically asked that he be allowed to make his case in full. She wanted the whole of it on the record. He was good. He was better than good. For 20 minutes, Teodoro Bracchi laid out a story about a boss who had gone soft and a clever woman who had emptied his pockets while he was distracted. And Odette watched the faces around that table and saw, one by one, the old men begin to nod, because it was a story that flattered everything they already believed. And when he had finished, Emiliano Vasari, who had never lost an argument in his life, did not say a single word in his own defense. He simply looked down the table and said, "My chief accountant will respond." She did not raise her voice. She had never raised her voice in her life. She opened a folder and she built the wall, one weight-bearing fact at a time. She began with the ghost crew, 60 men drawing pay at a terminal where the shift had been abolished in March, and gave the date it was abolished and the date the payroll continued, and the 6-year gap between them. She read out the registration dates of the 3 shell consultancies, noting without emphasis that the first had been incorporated 4 years before she entered the country. She laid the signature authorizations on the table. She produced the audit schedule, demonstrated it had been altered 3 times within a week of an inspection by a man sitting in the room. And then she turned to the story he had told about her, and she took it apart in 90 seconds, because a story is only a wall if every stone holds, and his had 1 stone that did not. The account he had opened in a name close to hers had been opened on a Tuesday in February. Odette had been in a hospital in another state that entire week, sitting with her mother, and there were 7 witnesses and a visitor log and a parking receipt. And she had brought all of them. She closed the folder. "That is my response," she said. The silence in that room was absolute. And then the oldest man at the table, who had not spoken all morning, looked at Teodoro Bracchi and said quietly, "Sit down. You are finished," and it was over. Teodoro Bracchi, the man who had smiled at Emiliano Vasari for 19 years while robbing him with his own pen, learned the price of underestimating her that same afternoon. Emiliano did not act in blind rage. He let the commission do it, which was worse. They stripped Teodoro of every asset and exposed 6 years of theft to the very families he had spent his life impressing, then cast him out. Alive, bankrupt, unemployable, his name a warning told to young lieutenants about what happens to men who steal from their own blood. He was permitted to live and required to live in the wreckage. And the old man agreed it was far crueler than any quick and merciful bullet. And Sabine Aldrich, who had said that nobody looks at a girl who does sums in a back office and sees a queen, found that the 11-day filing discrepancy Odette had mentioned so pleasantly at dinner had entered the record of the investigation and spent a very long season answering questions she could not answer well, and afterward watched from the far end of every table. Odette now sat at the head of as. Months later, on a bright morning washed gold with a new sun, Odette Reyes stood on the terrace of the fortress with a folder under her arm running the entire financial architecture of an empire that had never been cleaner, and she did not fold herself away anymore. She wore rich colors tailored to celebrate every curve she had spent 32 years apologizing for. She had stopped apologizing before she disagreed. Emiliano came out and stopped, simply to watch her. "You are going to tell me I am wrong about the northern contracts," he said. "I am," said Odette. "You are going to be right," he said. "I usually am," she said. He crossed to her and took the folder out of her hands and set it down and took her face in his. "Do you know what I understood that first morning in the boardroom?" He said quietly. I had spent 15 years being agreed with by frightened men, and I had begun to believe that was what power felt like. He tilted her chin up, his dark eyes soft in a way the rest of the world would never see. And then a woman nobody had bothered to introduce opened a folder and told me no. I realized I had not heard the truth spoken out loud in my own house in a decade. Everyone in my life tells me I am right. Testarda. You are the only person alive who tells me when I am not, and it is the single most valuable thing anyone has ever given me. Marry me and lose the argument just this once. Odette looked up at the man the whole city feared, a man who bowed to no one and yet bowed entirely to her. And for the first time in her life, she believed she was exactly enough. She had spent 32 years swallowing what she knew, watching men in better suits repeat her sentences badly, taught that a woman like her, who was right out loud, would only ever pay for it. And she had proven them all wrong because the thing the world had punished her for, he had never lost an argument in 15 years. And then a soft, quiet accountant walked in with a folder, told him no, and he spent the rest of his life grateful that she had. If Odette and Emiliano's story of hidden worth, sharp wits, and hard-won vindication moved you, if you cheered when the quiet accountant opened a folder and beat the most dangerous man on the coast at his own table, then do us a small favor before you go. Smash that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that being the smartest person in the room is nothing to apologize for. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another twist-filled tale of the overlooked soul who finally gets everything she deserves. And drop a comment below and tell us, what was your favorite moment in Odette and Emiliano's story?